All right, so you're back with us again for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
I'm really excited about this one.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about mental health on the show.
Absolutely. It's one of our most requested topics.
Yeah, and today we're kind of diving into a specific area, a recent finding that's really grabbed my attention. We've seen the stats, right? Teenage depression, it's a huge issue, and one of the things that keeps coming up is this difference between girls and boys.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a difference that starts to really show itself during those turbulent teenage years, right?
Exactly. And so this study we're looking at today, it sort of hints at a possible biological explanation for why teenage girls seem to be more susceptible to depression than boys.
It's really fascinating stuff. And what's really exciting is that it delves into this pathway in the brain called the Kynurenine Pathway.
Okay, the Kynurenine Pathway.
Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast.
Kynurenine Pathway. Kynurenine Pathway. I'm already tongue-tied.
Yeah, but don't worry. It's not as intimidating as it sounds.
So this study, it was published in Biological Psychiatry.
That's right. A very reputable journal in the field.
Yeah.
And it was supported by MQ Mental Health Research and the NIHR Maudsley BRC.
So we know it's coming from a credible source.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to break this down for you all.
Exactly. We want to give you those light bulb moments, really demystify this kynurenine pathway, what it is, how it might be linked to teenage depression, and why there seems to be this difference between girls and boys.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is this kynurenine pathway?
Okay, so basically it's a metabolic process that happens in your brain, a way your body breaks down an amino acid called tryptophan.
Tryptophan. Now that sounds familiar.
Yeah, you probably heard of it. It's the thing people blame for feeling sleepy after a big Thanksgiving turkey dinner.
Oh, right. Right. So this tryptophan that we get from our food, it ends up in our brain, and then this kynurenine pathway kicks in.
Precisely. Now, the interesting thing is this pathway, it's not a straight line. It has these 2 branches. So tryptophan gets broken down, and it can go in one of 2 directions.
Okay, so like a fork in the road.
Yeah, perfect analogy. One path leads to the production of compounds that are actually good for your brain. They're neuroprotective, meaning they protect your brain cells.
Okay, so that's the good path. And the other one?
Well, the other route leads to the production of substances that can be harmful to your brain, what we call neurotoxic.
So 2 possible outcomes, good and bad.
Yeah.
And it all depends on which way this tryptophan goes down the kynurenine pathway.
You got it. Now, the key players here, the byproducts of this pathway that we're really interested in are kynurenic acid, which is the good guy, the protector.
Kynurenic acid, good. Got it.
And then we have quinolinic acid, which is the one that can cause trouble.
Quinolinic acid, not so good.
Right. So imagine you want a healthy brain. You want more of the kynurenic acid, the protector, and less of that quinolinic acid, the troublemaker.
Makes sense. So where do teenagers fit into all of this?
Well, what this study did was it looked specifically at this pathway in adolescents, 14 to 16 years old.
And that's important because, a lot of times mental health research focuses on adults, but those teenage years are so crucial, right? That's when we see this big difference in depression rates between girls and boys start to appear.
Exactly. And adolescence is such a dynamic period. There are so many changes happening in the brain and the body. Hormones are surging. Social pressures are intensifying. It's a really vulnerable time.
So this study, it wanted to get a handle on what's going on biologically during this key developmental stage.
Exactly. And they focused on 150 teenagers from Brazil.
Brazil.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So how did they actually conduct this study? What did they do with these teenagers?
Well, they split them into 3 groups.
Okay.
50 teens in each group. And each group had an equal number of boys and girls.
Yeah.
That's important to keep in mind.
Right. To see if there are any differences between the sexes.
Exactly. So the first group was considered low risk for depression.
Okay.
The second group was considered high risk for depression.
Gotcha. And
The third group had already been diagnosed with depression.
Okay, so they had the full spectrum covered.
Right. And they used a measure from the IDA project to assess their risk level.
I see. So not just a random selection. They had a way to determine who is more likely to experience depression.
Precisely. So they had these 3 groups, and they took blood samples from each teenager to measure the levels of those key Kynurenine pathway chemicals, the kynurenic acid and the quinolinic acid.
Okay, so they're actually looking at what's happening in the brain through these blood tests.
Exactly. And here's the really cool part. They didn't just do this once. They followed up with these teenagers for 3 years.
3 years? Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, it gives you a much more complete picture of what's going on. It allows you to see how these biological markers relate to the course of depression over time.
So what did they find after all that?
Well, one of the key findings, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that the teenagers who were either at high risk for depression or already had a diagnosis, they had lower levels of kynurenic acid.
The protector.
Exactly.
So less of the good stuff.
Right. And this reduction was particularly noticeable in the female teenagers.
So the girls who were either at risk for depression or already depressed, they had even lower levels of this protective kynurenic acid compared to the boys.
Exactly. And that finding really jumps out at you because it suggests that this imbalance in the kynurenine pathway, specifically this lack of the protective compound, could be one of the reasons why teenage girls are more vulnerable to depression.
Okay, so that's a pretty big deal, right? It starts to give us a biological explanation for something that we've observed for a long time.
Absolutely. And it gives us a specific area to target for potential interventions.
So it's not just about saying, oh, girls are more emotional or they face more social pressure. It's actually saying, hey, there might be something going on at the molecular level that's contributing to this difference.
Exactly. It adds another layer to the understanding.
Now, the study also looked at inflammation.
Yes. We hear so much about inflammation these days, right? It seems to be linked to everything.
Right. So how does inflammation fit into all of this?
Well, they found that higher levels of inflammatory markers in the blood were associated with an increased production of quinolinic acid.
The troublemaker.
Exactly.
Right.
And this link was mainly seen in the teenagers who were either at high risk or already depressed.
So it's like inflammation might be tipping the scales, pushing the kynurenine pathway towards producing more of the harmful stuff.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if maybe finding ways to reduce inflammation could potentially have a positive impact on mental health.
So it's all interconnected, this whole system. It's not just about what's happening in the brain, but also what's happening in the body.
Precisely. And that's why this research is so fascinating, because it's starting to connect these different pieces of the puzzle.
Now, they followed these teenagers for 3 years, right? So what happened? Did the kynurenine pathway levels have any connection to whether their depression persisted or if they got better?
Yes, they did. They found that the female adolescents who continued to experience depression over those 3 years had higher levels of the neurotoxic metabolites compared to the girls whose depression improved.
So the ones who stayed depressed had more of the bad stuff in their system.
Exactly. Which suggests that this increased neurotoxic activity might make it harder for some teenage girls to recover.
So that's pretty significant, right? It's not just about who develops depression, but also who might have a harder time overcoming it.
Absolutely. It adds another layer of complexity to the picture.
One of the researchers, Professor Valeria Mondelli, she made a really interesting comment. She said that adolescence is a time of huge change, but we still don't fully understand the biological factors driving depression and the differences between boys and girls. And she hopes that research like this can help paint a clearer picture.
And it really does, because for so long we focused primarily on the psychological and social aspects of depression, which are undoubtedly important. But this biological piece has been somewhat neglected.
Right. It's like we've been trying to solve a puzzle with only half the pieces.
Exactly. And this research is starting to fill in those missing pieces.
Yeah. Another researcher, Dr. Nagman Nikislat, she suggested that measuring these chemicals in the kynurenine pathway could help identify teenagers who are at higher risk for persistent depression, particularly girls.
And that's huge, because if you can identify those at risk early on, you can intervene earlier and potentially prevent things from escalating.
Right. It's all about early intervention and prevention.
And it's not just about medication either.
Right.
Dr. Nikisat also talked about lifestyle interventions like diet and exercise that could influence this pathway.
So it's like we have some agency here. It's not just about our genes or our brain chemistry. We can actually do things to potentially improve our mental health.
Exactly, and that's a really empowering message.
So to wrap up, what's the big takeaway here for our listeners?
Well, I'd say the main takeaway is that this research sheds new light on the biological underpinnings of teenage depression. It suggests that this Kynurenine pathway, and specifically an imbalance in this pathway, with less of the good stuff and potentially more of the harmful stuff, might play a key role. And this imbalance seems to be more pronounced in girls, which could help explain why they experience depression at higher rates.
And this imbalance could be influenced by things like inflammation, which opens up a whole new avenue for potential interventions.
Exactly. And while this research doesn't give us all the answers, it does give us some very valuable clues and directions for future research.
It's like a roadmap for understanding teenage depression in a more comprehensive way.
Absolutely.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How something like your diet or how much inflammation you have in your body could actually impact your mental well-being.
It highlights the interconnectedness of everything. Our physical health and our mental health are not separate entities. They're intertwined.
So it's not just about going to therapy or taking medication. It's about taking care of your whole self.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that mental health is complex and multifaceted. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
And there's still so much we don't know.
Absolutely. But research like this gives us hope that we're moving in the right direction towards a deeper understanding and more effective treatments.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Oh, there's so much more to explore. And hopefully this has given our listeners a good starting point for their own research and reflection.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
And take care of yourselves.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Looking forward to it. Okay.
Bye, everyone.
See you later.